Okay, well, good morning and happy feast.
Good morning.
The good news, it's all going to be okay. It's all going to work out. The Bible is the most important textbook in the world. It's unique. It's not a detailed science book or a detailed geology or geography book. And in most areas, it's not extremely detailed in technical ways or other matters like that. It tells us about mankind's moral condition. From the very start, the good, the bad, and a lot of the stuff in between. There's been an awful lot of bad, but hope still comes through in the pages of the Bible. Some I remember in the older school books, the older textbooks, like I can remember when I was in elementary school, some of you can, when the lessons in each chapter, you had lessons, but the answers were in the back of the book. Now, I don't know that they do that today, probably not, but the answers were in the back of the book. For the most part, students didn't dare to cheat and get the answer from the back of the book because teachers could read your mind. They knew what you were thinking. And if they caught you, which they surely would, even worse, they might make you stand in front of the class and explain how you got the answer detail by detail. And if all you did was copy it from the back of the book, you'd have no idea, no clue as to how you got the answer. So that would really be embarrassing. So kids were not inclined to cheat, at least not the reasonably smart ones. Do we struggle with temptation? I heard of someone who said, I don't struggle with temptation, I just give in to it. Done deal. I think that reply was meant to, we all do that with food, don't we? I think that reply was meant to be a tongue-in-cheek answer. And by the way, I looked this up. I was kind of curious about tongue-in-cheek. What on earth does that mean? The opposite to tongue-in-cheek is with a straight face. We have a lot of weird little customs in how we get expressions. The Bible also gives us answers of what will happen in the future. So it's in a way like the old textbook with the answers in the back. God gives us answers in the Bible. We have to look for them sometimes. It's not always easy to find the answers, but they're there. And fortunately, there's no rule or law against looking in the back of the book to get the answers in the Bible. They're there for us to find. But the fact is, there isn't a day that goes by that we're not tempted in some way to bend or break the rules, even if it's only in our thoughts as to how we should conduct ourselves. Temptation can come in many forms. We're tempted to not tell the whole truth. Even people who are noted for not telling the truth or being lies, they tell the truth, just not the whole truth. Why do they swear you in? Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Because if you don't tell the whole truth, that can amount to a real mistake, put it that way. Or tempted to take something that isn't yours, whether it's utilizing time in a way you shouldn't be using it, taking advantage of others, either their other hospitality beyond what's reasonable, to gossip, to overindulge. Who can resist gossip, by the way? It's everywhere. Social media could not exist without gossip. To hold a grudge against someone, we see that from the smallest child on up, and unfortunately, many of us never grow out of it. And to withhold from the Lord that which rightfully belongs to Him. Now, wait a minute. You say, well, when have we done that to the Lord, to God, to Jesus? In Matthew 25, when the Son of Man shall come, I think I read it, started at 31. When the Son of Man shall come in His glory, and shall all the holy angels with Him, then shall He sit upon the throne of His glory. And before Him shall He gather all the nations, and He shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And I'm going to skip over to 41. Then shall He say unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was a hungered, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, you took me not in. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick, in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, did not minister to you? Then shall he answer them, Verily I say to you, inasmuch as you did it not to the least of these, his brethren, you did it not to me. Temptation is everywhere. What's ours? It varies by the person. How do we handle temptation? Do we struggle? Can we do anything to win this struggle over temptation? Is it even possible to always resist temptation? To answer that question, we look to the Bible, and of course, I believe it says, yes, there is. Turn with me to the book of James, chapter 1. We'll read verses 1 through 18. It's not difficult to see the connection between adversity and temptation, and what we think of things and whether we act on it or don't act on it. Remember, temptation is not the sin. It's giving into a temptation that leads to something wrong that is. James 1 through 18. James, a servant of God of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into different temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith works patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that gives to all men liberally and upbraids not, and it shall be given to him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a sea of the wave, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Let the brother of a low degree rejoice in that he is exalted, but the rich in that he is made low, because as the flower of the grass he shall pass away. For the sun is no longer risen with the burning heat, but it withers the grass, and the flower thereof falls, and the grace of the fashion of it perishes. So also shall the rich man fade away in his ways. Blessed is the man that endures temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to them that love him. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil. Neither tempts he any man, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. This whole thing begins with us. It's in us. We're born with it. Then when the lust has conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift, every perfect gift is from above. Comes down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will he begot us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures, or creation. Remember what the Boy Scouts motto is? Be prepared. So we should not be surprised when temptation comes to us. It's going to. We should simply be prepared that something's going to hit us to tempt us. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. The first step that we can take is a step of preparation. If we're going to successfully handle temptation, we must expect it first. James says, when tempted. He did not say, if tempted. We should never be surprised when we're tempted. We need to understand several things about temptation, though. First, we should understand that temptation is universal. Everyone is tempted. If you hear of someone who is never tempted by anything, there's one conclusion you could probably reach, and that is that person is probably dead, because only the dead are not tempted anymore. They're done. They're finished. They're asleep for the present. The moment we entered this world, we were drafted into a lifelong life of temptation, basically. Some justified, some not. Babies need things naturally for them to grow. That's a justified thing. We need to understand at the outset that as Christian soldiers, there's no sin in being tempted. No one can eradicate enticements, but we are responsible for what we do or just how we handle it. Anything can be handled in a wrong way, even though what you're trying to achieve, what do they call that? Unintended consequences. Your intent isn't to do something wrong, but you picked a bad way to handle it and it didn't turn out well. We need to understand that temptation is personal. We all have our personal temptations. We're all vulnerable in different ways. Temptation is a personal thing. Some things that do not tempt you will tempt me. Some things that tempt another person, will not tempt most other people, though. You can be sure that temptation will be tailor-made for each of us. There's no doubt that temptation is going to come to us, so we could be prepared for the times when it will. We need to be ready. We need to expect temptation. We shouldn't be surprised when it hits us. Also, don't be confused by it. Next time in handling temptation, or the next step in handling temptation, is to understand where temptation comes from. Some might be tempted to blame God. The earliest record of shifting blame actually began in the Garden of Eden, didn't it? Satan, symbolized by the serpent, accused God of deceiving Adam and Eve for no good reason. Well, God shouldn't have withheld all that from them, thus tempting them to do something that they shouldn't have done. That's what Satan was trying to do. Then Adam blamed Eve for his part in the disobedience to God by saying, "Why, the woman whom you gave me to be with me, she gave me of the tree and I ate it." Then Eve blamed Satan, who after all is called the tempter, and really did lie and put the temptation before Eve. She made the choice, but he made it possible. And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me and I ate it." But Eve, along with Adam, were responsible for that bad choice, weren't they? Today, we carry on the tradition of our first parents with very subtle reasoning, saying, people behave the way they do because that's how God made them. He created them with a certain temperament, and so they can't help doing what they do. So it is ultimately God's fault. That's what people want to say. Notice that when confronted by God for his sin, Adam's logic. First, he blamed Eve, the woman, but indirectly he blamed God, the woman whom you gave me. You're the one who put her here. Mankind is still playing the same old blame game. When something really bad happens, what does the world call it? An act of God. Why don't they call it an act of Satan? Or, it kind of bugs me when every time I'll hear that, an act of God, which half of them don't believe in God anyway. So, it's really an oxymoron, I guess you would say. It's a blame game. James quickly refutes the idea that evil comes from God when in verse 13 he says, absolutely and categorically, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. God created the universe. We have opportunities. How we're handling it determines the outcome of whether it's going to be a good one or a bad one, of course. To believe that God is the source of temptation is just wrong-headed thinking. Unless we understand the real source of temptation, we will respond to it incorrectly. God is not the author of temptation, nor does he have any capacity to want to tempt anyone. His holy character is incompatible with that. God cannot sin. It's like us trying to comprehend infinity. Some of these things are hard to get your mind around, but we're told that that's an absolute. If God is not to blame, who is? How about Satan? Is he to blame? Maybe, some years ago, remember Flip Wilson, when he made the phrase famous, the devil made me do it. And certainly Satan does tempt us. I mean, there's no question Satan is a tempter. He tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden, so Satan does have a hand in our temptation. But often Satan gets too much credit. He has a partner in crime, us. He gets too much credit. There must be something there for Satan's temptations to be effective. Besides declaring that each person is responsible for his own temptation, Jesus is careful to point out that temptation is not an event, but a process. James is the only place in the Bible that the process of allurement is really brought out clearly. Allurement. Maybe that's where you get the word allure for a fishing lure, at any rate. In verse 14, James explains, but each one is tempted by his lust, being drawn away and seduced by them. He's bringing this out, that these desires, when they get out of place, it can cause harm to us. And then when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin. When sin is fully formed, it brings forth death. If we don't want Satan to take advantage of us, it is vital that we understand the adversary's strategic process, what Paul calls Satan's devices. What are the devices of Satan? Well, first it begins with desire. James tells us what it is. Each one is tempted by his or her own lust, our own evil desire. This is the beginning of a process that can only be described as a downward death spiral. The desire to sin is already within us. If it wasn't so, then sin wouldn't be attractive, would it? I mean, you're only can be tempted if something is attractive to you in some way. It's going to satisfy something or give you something. On first glance, you might think that sin is some sort of a magnet. But that's not true. The magnet is within us, not it. It is our desire that the problem or the damage occurs through. Our desires are extremely powerful. Now, not all desires are wrong. Many desires keep us alive because, we need to be healthy, and some of these desires are self-preservation. But even good desires taken to excess can cause us great harm. I think of food when I think of that one. The desire for food or sexual fulfillment or relief from pain can turn into obsessions. This thing about all the opioid epidemic and all that, so many people apparently, it started out with a trip to the dentist or something. They weren't trying to do anything wrong, but little by little, they were pulled into something that felt good without realizing where they were headed. Second thing is it leads to deception. James tells us that because of our desire, we are dragged away and seduced or enticed. The word enticed, it's used like a fishing term that means to lure by bait. So it is connected there, that word. And the purpose of bait is deception. If you bait your hook with a nice juicy worm, you have two purposes in mind. The first is to lure the fish in order to pull that fish out from its hiding place. We've got to find a bait that will interest the fish, something it wants. Now, that's natural to the fish. He just doesn't expect there to be a hook in the thing. The hook is there. Satan is a hook. The second is to hide the hook. We are enticed by sin in part because we don't see the consequences. The fish didn't see the hook. If he saw the hook and it was a smart fish, he wouldn't bite it, would he? Now, apparently some fish will bite anything. But the hook is there. We're simply deceived into believing that it's not. We overlook the little lump on the end of the worm or something. The consequence of sin is real. If we saw it clearly, we would, without a doubt, not do what we were tempted to do. We'd make another choice. In our youth, running around with friends and drinking may have seemed like a good time. But when we see the flashing blue lights or a car wrapped around a tree or the tragic loss of life caused by drinking, we can see that the pleasure was not worth it. And I can remember Fortunately, I wasn't in those cars, but I can remember seeing friends in high school that ended up that way, splattered across the highway. Third thing, it results in disobedience. It begins with desire, leads to deception, and results in disobedience. Sin is disobedience to God. James tells us, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. The two elements, the bait and the desire, join together to give birth to sin. It's conceived. That's bad enough, but it doesn't end there. Fourth, it ends in death. And sin, when it is fully formed, brings forth death. And even though sin sometimes brings a temporary period of pleasure, and the Bible mentions that too, it always leads to death, although this is not immediately apparent. We have all sinned, and God did not strike us dead. That's not an encouragement. That's a reality that cause and effect don't automatically follow immediately, do they? Has anybody ever driven in icy conditions to where when you hit the brake or turn the wheel and nothing happens and you can't slow down, and it's like very slowly you just slide toward whatever you're going to impact and you can do nothing about it? So sometimes there's a delay in the decision to come into the curve maybe faster than you should have. But once there, you're along for the ride, as they say. If we continue to sin and do not respond to God's mercy by forsaking sins, a strange condition may be created. James is not referring here to physical death, for then none of us would be alive. The fulfillment of our lust brings about in the believer's life a death-like existence where they don't care. Whether this is getting close into that unpardonable sin, I don't know, but it kind of makes me think that way. That where we don't care. And if we don't care, we will die to the things of God. The things of God, and you probably know people who you're just a little amazed at somebody who maybe knew a lot of truth, and all of a sudden things you thought never would they ever think weren't important, they don't care about them anymore. I've been told that is the beginning of the real unpardonable sin when someone reaches a condition like that. King David sinned, but did not reach the point where he didn't care. In Psalms 51:12, after his sin with Bathsheba, David prayed, "Lord, restore to me the joy of my salvation." Sin robs us of our joy. If you want to handle temptation successfully, take a good look at all of this, with David especially. Look at what is causing it. Look at where it's taking you or us. Look at the consequences. Look at where you will end up. If you do, you will come to one conclusion: it is not worth it. Now, I believe all of us here today have already come to that conclusion. So we come to the final step in the process of dealing successfully with temptation. The battlefield for resisting being drawn away from God is in our mind. It's all internal. That's why Satan couldn't make any headway against Jesus. Each time we yield to temptation, we believe a lie, and what's worse, we start living one too. That is so true in many areas, like whether there's something positive you're building up. Each time you do something, you build a little muscle or pattern to do it again. And if that is something bad, you're building a pattern or strength to repeat the error. And the error becomes easier and easier. Just like I've used an example of smoking. I can remember as a kid learning to smoke. Nobody gets the habit of smoking accidentally. I can remember coughing and trying to inhale. Nobody accidentally gets addicted to smoking. It was that peer pressure and this image thing and other things that made it attractive. And, I wanted to learn how to smoke and be cool. So, so nobody accidentally begins to smoke. Don't be deceived by the temptation. The final step of the process of dealing with temptation is, of course, if you have enough information to say that this is wrong, and you probably do have that information, then reject it then. James tells us in verse 16, don't be deceived, my dear brothers. In other words, don't fall for the temptation, reject it. Once you see it for what it is, get away from it. Be warned. Don't take the warning lightly. We must not take temptation lightly, no matter how it appears. Like who was Potiphar's wife that grabbed David? He fled. He fled, which was probably a tempting proposition that she was offering him. But get away from it when you realize that, hey, this is bad. Get away from it. The good news is that those who are of God's household can resist temptation. The good news is that we can win over temptation. Temptation doesn't have to defeat us. We have the power of Christ's Spirit within us. Remember in Luke 24:49, Jesus said he would send the Comforter, that his disciples would be endued with power from on high. He was talking about the gift of the Holy Spirit. It is the essence that begets us as children of God. We are begotten, and at the first resurrection, God's begotten children will be born as spirit beings, just as Jesus said they would be. Look at verse 18. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Everything that we need is given to us through the life of Christ with the Spirit that he has given. It is the indwelling of the Spirit that makes the difference. There was a phrase that may have been used or overly used in the past in the world, maybe with good intent, and used for marketing and stuff, but yet it has some valid use, and that is, what would Jesus do? They made bracelets and everything, and but nevertheless, it made you think about things. In conclusion here, wrapping this up, it's a little long, but don't be surprised by temptation. Expect it. It comes to everyone. It will come to you and me. It is inevitable. Many of us pray for deliverance from some temptation only to turn right around and expose ourselves to it again. Think of it this way: to pray against temptation and yet to rush into occasions that are similar, you should recognize the same. That it's like putting your hand in a hot barbecue and then praying you won't get burned. This is just not logical, is it? What if we still mess up? We make an error. We repeat something we shouldn't have repeated. 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Have a great feast.